Welcome to The Explainer. So let's jump right in. Between the years 1200 and 1450, humanity achieved some absolutely incredible things. We built these vast, interconnected networks of exchange that practically shrink the globe. It was a real game changer. But there's a profound paradox here. The exact same networks that built this incredibly connected world, they were the very things that tore it down.
Imagine the bustling routes of Eurasia for a second. We're talking caravans carrying luxurious silk, aromatic spices, and revolutionary technologies, like paper, across vast distances. It was this era of unprecedented wealth and cultural exchange. But hidden right there among the merchants, the livestock, and the cargo, these world-famous trade routes were secretly transporting a silent, invisible killer. So you've got to wonder, how exactly does a highway of commerce transform into a weapon of mass destruction? Okay, let's dive into this. During this period, these massive trade routes were dual purpose. Sure, they were the ultimate channels of commerce, but they simultaneously acted as channels of contagion. We're talking about a pandemic, an epidemic disease spreading across multiple countries or continents. And a pandemic on this kind of massive scale meant you simply could not have one without the other. They were totally linked. Section 1. Anatomy of a pandemic, the microscopic invader. So the culprit here is a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. Step 1 in this deadly chain. It naturally thrives in the burrowing rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe. We're talking animals like marmots, gerbils, and rats. And evidence actually points to these rodent populations being exposed to highly virulent strains during the massive disruptions caused by the Mongol conquests. Then, step 2. Fleas ingest this bacterium. Step 3. When those infected rats travel along with human settlements and merchant caravans, the fleas jump and bite human hosts. And finally, step 4, the bacterium enters the human lymphatic system. It is a completely fatal chain reaction, and it was triggered entirely by human movement. And once that infection takes hold, the results are, they're incredibly visceral. The bubonic plague produces swollen lymph nodes called buboes, along with high fever, and literally the blackening of the skin due to hemorrhaging. Left untreated, it was fatal in 30 to 90% of cases. But incredibly, there was a secondary variant that was even worse, the pneumonic plague. This form spread through airborne droplets, meaning you didn't even need a flea bite. No, you just had to breathe the same air as someone who was infected. And because of this airborne transmission, the pneumonic variant spread like wildfire. It was practically unstoppable in dense urban centers, and it was nearly 100% fatal. Just devastating. Now, we really need to reframe how we think about this event. The Black Death, which happened roughly between 1331 and 1353, is so often taught as just a European tragedy. But actually, it was absolutely not just a European catastrophe. It was a true Eurasian pandemic. Islamic chroniclers called it the waba, European writers called it the Great Mortality, and it ultimately killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of affected populations, stretching all the way across the Middle East, Europe, China, and Central Asia. Getting this framing right, seeing it as a massive Eurasian event, is absolutely crucial to grasping the sheer scale of the devastation. And when you look at the terrifying speed at which this microscopic threat traveled westward, it maps perfectly onto the Mongol trade and military networks. It's like a giant, deadly puzzle. We see records of massive mortality in Hebei province, China, as early as the 1330s. Then, by 1346, it hits the Black Sea trading port of Kaffa. Literally the very next year, 1347, fleeing Genoese merchants carry it right into the Mediterranean. By 1349, it sweeps through northern Europe. And incredibly, by 1350, it crosses the sea to reach Iceland. In less than 2 decades, it engulfed half the known world. Now, the story of how the plague actually breached the walls of Europe is, honestly, it's horrifying. In 1346, at the trading port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, Mongol forces were laying siege to the Genoese city. As the plague ravaged the Mongol army, they reportedly took their plague-infected corpses and catapulted them over the city walls. I mean, it's one of history's first documented incidents of biological warfare, and it was the fleeing Genoese merchants from this exact siege who carried the disease onto their ships, which directly launched the plague right into the heart of Europe. Because pre-modern record-keeping was pretty sparse, the exact numbers are estimates, sure, but the demographic catastrophe is staggering across the board. To put this into perspective, Europe lost anywhere from 1/3 to half of its population. That is roughly 25 million people out of 75 million just gone. And the Islamic heartland suffered equally. Egypt lost an estimated 40% of its population, while Syria and Iraq faced devastating depopulation. It was just a completely indiscriminate demographic collapse. But, right behind these massive numbers is a really intense, tragic human element. The great Syrian historian and sociologist Ibn Khaldun, who actually personally lost his own parents to the plague, wrote this in 1377. He said, "Civilization had been struck as if by a bolt from the sky. The East and the West had been depopulated and the world had changed." The psychological weight of this loss on the survivors was simply immeasurable. And what makes this all even more tragic is that the Black Death wasn't just a one-and-done event. It returned in successive waves, first between 1361 and 1363, then again in 1374, and it continued with intermittent outbreaks for the next 3 centuries. These successive waves meant that populations simply could not bounce back. I mean, in England, the population didn't return to its pre-plague levels until the 16th century. In the Middle East, the recovery took even longer. Entire generations were forced to live under the constant looming shadow of the plague's return. Section 2. Social and economic shockwaves. The aftershock of survival. Now, the economic paradox of the plague is absolutely fascinating. Before the outbreak, you had a strict feudal system where lords extracted mandatory labor from serfs. Basically, there were plenty of workers to go around. But post-plague, a catastrophic reduction in the labor supply gave the surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Lords actually had to compete for scarce workers by offering better wages and living conditions. So, paradoxically, massive death actually empowered the surviving working class. And this brilliantly illustrates the shift. The ultimate proof of this empowered workforce is the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. When lords desperately attempted to reimpose those old, strict pre-plague labor obligations, the workers rebelled. They had learned their true market value. This incredible shift in power dynamics actively accelerated the end of serfdom in Western Europe. The surviving workers realized, hey, we hold all the cards now. But of course, alongside those economic shifts came a profound crisis of faith and societal breakdown. The plague didn't spare the righteous, it struck down half of Europe's parish priests and its most learned monks. So when prayer and church sacraments completely failed to protect the faithful, the spiritual confidence of everyday people was severely shaken. This led to a huge long-term questioning of ecclesiastical authority. Desperation led to extreme movements, like the flagellants in Germany and the Low Countries, who publicly whipped themselves to try and appease divine wrath. And even more tragically, this desperation fueled vicious scapegoating. Baseless, entirely unfounded accusations that Jewish communities were poisoning wells led to horrific massacres across Central Europe. The social fabric was literally tearing apart. Meanwhile, the political fallout was equally massive back in Asia. The sheer population decline and instability in China during this period actively contributed to the collapse of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. And out of that collapse rose the Ming dynasty in 1368. Now, here is a fascinating geopolitical ripple effect. The new Ming rulers remembered the horrors of the pandemic that had traveled via overland trade. That dark memory heavily influenced their subsequent policies of relative isolation from overland Central Asian commerce. So in the short term, the plague was an absolute disaster for commerce. Caravans disbanded, bustling ports closed down, merchants fled, and the powerful trade networks of the Hanseatic League, Venice, and Genoa just collapsed. But the medium-term impact is a massive paradox. A smaller surviving population meant significantly less competition for resources. Wages rose and per capita wealth actually increased. So, the higher standard of living for the surviving artisan and merchant classes actively paved the way for the great economic recovery and the increased wealth of the late 14th and 15th centuries. Pretty crazy, right? As we step back from the 14th century, a really clear recurring pattern emerges in world history. The exact same infrastructure that accelerates commercial exchange always accelerates infectious disease. We see it with the Mongol road networks and the Black Death. We see it in the 16th century with maritime expansion, bringing smallpox during the Columbian Exchange. We see it in the 20th century with global troop movements spreading influenza during World War I. And of course, we've all lived it in the 21st century with COVID-19 riding the incredibly fast networks of modern globalization. Time and time again, channels of commerce are always channels of contagion. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to ponder. If history repeatedly shows us that human connection always brings the risk of contagion, is the ultimate price of a globalized, wealthy, interconnected world always going to be a pandemic?
It's a heavy question for sure, but understanding how the Eurasian exchange network shaped and simultaneously destroyed human populations in the 14th century gives us an incredibly powerful lens for looking at our own world today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.